Hey guys, it's Anne. Today I'm super excited about this video because I want to talk about my favorite podcasts. I love podcasts. I commute via train to school and to work sometimes, so I'm always listening to podcasts when I'm commuting or when I'm like taking breaks between studying or anything like that. And I really like podcasts that like make me laugh or like help me relax, that like aren't too serious but that I still feel like I learned something from. So if that's something that like you look for in podcasts, I definitely think my recommendations will be relevant to you. I will say also before we get started, I'm a political science student in college, and so a lot of the podcasts that I listen to and like the content that I consume in general, besides kind of like beauty and lifestyle content, is like politics and news oriented. So if that's not something that you're necessarily interested in, these recommendations, some of them may not be relevant to you, and I'm only going to mention 5, so just keep that in mind. But if that does seem like something that you may be interested in, or if you're curious about what podcasts I like to listen to, definitely keep on watching. So the first one that I want to mention is my all-time favorite, Lovett or Leave It, and it's part of a lot of the podcasts that I love are under the Crooked Media umbrella, which is the like Pod Save America, Pod Save the World, Pod Save People. Those podcasts are all part of this umbrella, and Love It or Leave It is also. And it's hard to choose just one of those podcasts, and I'm going to mention a few of them that I love, but Love It or Leave It is just so funny and like irreverent. It's hosted by John Lovett, who's a former Obama speechwriter, and he is just like hilarious and irreverent, like I said, and just like it's really like a kind of comedy, like I don't even know how to describe it because it is so political, and like obviously he's so political, but it doesn't feel like a news show, you know what I mean? So that's why I love that one so much, because sometimes, especially like taking politics classes, I get so fatigued by like political media sometimes, and I don't want to listen to it, but I still want to like be informed, and I still want to be like engaged in the conversation about politics. So that's a really awesome way for me to kind of do that and then not feel like it's too much or overwhelming a lot of the time. So I would definitely recommend that podcast to, I think, anyone. I think like if you're interested in politics, you'll love it, but even if you're not necessarily, I think you'd still find it really funny and fun to listen to. I'm actually going to be at the Portland taping in January, so I'm super excited for that. I've never seen a podcast live before. The next one I want to mention is Pod Save America. This is another one of those podcasts under the Crooked Media umbrella. Pod Save America is hosted by John Lovett and then 2 other former Obama staffers, and they're just fun and funny and also really bring like a great perspective when talking about politics, the politics of today. So I would definitely recommend that podcast as well. But I know that one's super popular, so I don't feel like I need to say quite as much about that one, but other than just I love it and would highly recommend it. The next one is also a Crooked Media podcast. This is the last one, I promise. This one is really interesting though. It's hosted by a woman named Anna Marie Cox, who has worked for like MTV, like interviews that she does with all kinds of different people, and the idea of it is kind of that they're like uncomfortable or maybe like difficult conversations that like are really important. And the guests that she gets and brings on are always really interesting, and usually they're people that I haven't heard of before or that I'm not familiar with, so or that I'm like a little bit familiar with but would like to know more about. So I feel like it's always something that I'm like really engaged with and like is really relevant to me. And then also just like her perspective, she talks about a lot of like kind of like more feminist, like women's issues than some of the other Crooked Media hosts, just because she is a woman, I think, and she brings on a lot of female guests and a lot of like women of color as guests, and it's just like all around like, and she's just like a really coming, I think one of my favorite things about her as an interviewer is she's always coming from this place of like wanting to learn from her guests. Like she is always like as kind of curious as me as the listener, which I feel like sometimes like when you're listening to an interview, like the interviewer is just, it's just like less genuine, and like her perspective in her hosting and interviewing is so like coming from this like amazing like genuine place of wanting to learn and like have these interesting conversations. So that's another podcast that I think I would recommend to anyone, even if you're not necessarily interested in like politics or social issues. Like, it's just so interesting, and she brings on people who she disagrees with, and like it's just really, really good. So I would highly, highly recommend that one. There's only 2 left, and neither of them are Crooked Media podcasts. So the next one is the Friendly Atheist. Obviously, it's a podcast about kind of like religious issues in America, and just like news topics that relate to religion and how those relate to like skeptics and humanists and atheists and non-religious people. That was just a lot of euphemisms for atheists, but I'm an atheist, and so I just really like that podcast. And it's hosted by Lovett, who writes the blog The Friendly Athiest, and he has a YouTube channel as well. And I went through a phase of my life where I was like super obsessed with kind of like new atheism and all the kind of like atheists that are in the media, and I'm not really as like engaged with that community anymore. It's kind of like in the past for me, but Hemant Mehta and then Matt Dillahunty are the 2 that like I still really like to like listen to the content that they put out. So Hemant it's a really good description of him as like the friendly atheist, because he's like just very friendly and funny and fun to listen to. There's a co-host, it's a woman named Jessica, who's so funny, and I really just like identify with her a lot, so I feel like her and I are pals, even though obviously we've never met. But I definitely recommend that podcast, especially if you're interested in like separation of church and state issues and just like religious, like public religious issues. But it is a podcast about atheism, so when I added that to this list, I was like, that could be controversial. But it's a great podcast. It is genuinely my favorite, one of my top 5. And this is my channel and my video, so I'm gonna tell you guys the truth. And I do think it would be accessible even if you're like not an atheist, or if you are a religious person but maybe you're, I don't know, like I think it's the most accessible piece of like atheist content I've ever come across to people who don't necessarily identify with that labeling. Okay, I'm gonna move on. The final podcast is Ladies Who Lunch. This podcast is co-hosted by Ingrid Nilsson, who's a YouTuber here, probably my like #1 favorite beauty and lifestyle YouTuber. She's just amazing. If you aren't familiar with her, I can't imagine that you aren't. She's like a lesbian. She does a lot of like really cool kind of like more feminist lifestyle content. She interviewed Obama, but then she also does like just like straight up makeup videos. She's kind of probably like my #1 YouTube inspiration, actually, now that I'm like kind of thinking about it. I just love her so much. So she hosts this podcast with this woman named Kat Valdez, who's also a YouTuber, and they just talk about, they did a whole month of episodes about mental health. They talk about like LGBTQ issues. They talk about like media and like pop culture, and I just love Ingrid so much. And if you don't love Ingrid, then I don't know what you're doing. And it's kind of a cool like different side of her, because she kind of talks a little bit more in the podcast, because obviously it's a podcast, so you have to. And then also it's like no like beauty content, and I love her beauty content, don't get me wrong, but it is cool to kind of see like for her to have this platform of being like all kind of like social, like women's feminist lesbian stuff. I don't know, it's awesome. She's awesome. So yeah, those are actually my top 5 podcasts. I feel like that was pretty quick. And let me know if you already listened to any of those podcasts, or if you're going to check any of them out. And then I am always looking for new podcasts to check out, so definitely drop some recommendations for me of your favorites down below. And it was awesome chatting with you guys. Be sure to like, subscribe, and check back soon next week for a new video. Bye!